Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
You good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not detain you long.
Tom Secker, welcome back to Fortress on a Hill. Thank you for joining us to discuss this movie today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always great to be talking with you guys. And this is a quite brilliant but also terrible film that we're going to be talking about, with some amazing ideas and themes in there. This is going to be a good one. I can feel it.
Yeah, it does wax between. Some moments are little spots of brilliance, and other ones are just beyond idiotic. It's like what Jack Bauer advisor put this idea in this movie. Although I think this might predate Jack Bauer by just a little bit, not much, just a little bit.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about The Siege with Denzel Washington, Annette Benning, and Bruce Willis. It is from 1998, where a series of terrorist cells are committing bombings in New York City, and Anthony Hubbard, played by Denzel Washington, is the lead FBI agent, the assistant special agent in charge, trying to take this down. Annette Benning plays Elise. I can't remember her last name at the moment, but her name keeps changing. She works for the CIA, so that's a fun thing, watching her do the revolving door of names and having different people call her different things. So before we get into the story of the movie, and I'm going to do my best to limit this as we go forward, but going through the script the last few days, I've noticed some really, really interesting changes to the main script, because I actually got a copy of the original script, and going through it, there was a lot of things that really stuck out to me that would have made this movie different and possibly received differently. One common thing that I think everybody needs to know is that there were a large group of Arab Americans that protested this film when it first came out. There were claims of that they were scapegoating Muslims, that the imagery in the movie shows Muslims praying, Muslims responding to walking to prayer call, washing their hands, and it shows all this different imagery without very much context. And if you've ever seen the movie, you probably remember what I'm talking about. But with the changes, it really made it into an entirely different film. So the film begins with a ambush of a sheik. I want to say he's believed to be in Lebanon at the time it happens, and I assume they're Americans, but I guess they could be Israeli. But Special Forces takes into custody this sheik. He's Iraqi by nationality. They don't really give us a whole lot other than the name they give for him is Sheikh Ahmed bin Talal, and that he was Iraqi. This is the first really big change with the script, and essentially what happened is that, as opposed to some of the quick cuts they use to imply the action at the scene, because we don't really see any specific battle, we hear a bunch of machine guns go off behind a wall, and then some goats run away, and they take the sheik away somewhere. Well, in the original script, it goes very much in the vein of The Dark Knight, where there's a balloon set up and a C-130 comes through and snatches ye old Sheik from the ground and takes him that way. There's a whole sequence that they have set up for that. So that entire thing was removed. I'm wondering maybe if that was to soften the idea of the ambush, of the rendition, the kidnapping essentially is what they did with this guy. Um, hold on.
What I'm wondering about that, now that you've brought it up, I did not know about this. Maybe that, I mean, you're talking about a skyhook, right? One of
Yeah.
those things on the front of a plane, and it
Yeah.
grabs the rope and yanks the person off the ground. These were first seen in films. Thunderball, I think, is the first film where that was ever used, and there is also one in the Green Berets a few years later. Those things aren't easy to get your hands on, particularly not if you want it to work kind of semi-properly, so it looks good on camera.
Yeah.
I bring this up because the only ones that I know about, except for in The Dark Knight, where they actually used a real plane, it was provided either by the military or the CIA. So I'm wondering, did they go to the DoD for support for this movie? Because the story that I've read, and I've never come across documents backing this up or proper interviews or anything that I would say is solid, but I have read that they did go to the DoD and ask them for support on this movie and were turned down because of the whole premise about, you know, General John McClane invading New York City. And so maybe that was changed in part because they couldn't actually do it. From a production point of view, that's a very difficult thing to hire someone privately to do. That would probably be very expensive. So the only real option is to go to someone like the Air Force. And if they said they wouldn't work on the film, then you basically just can't have that in your script anymore. You just can't do it from a production point of view. There may be other reasons why it was changed, and that story about them getting rejected by the DoD may not actually be true. I should, clarify, I really don't know what the status of the relationship between this movie and the Pentagon was.
Yeah, that would make sense. This was, I mean, I wouldn't say this was before the era of more CGI stuff. I'm guessing that was how they did most of that scene for The Dark Knight, aside from probably the actual plane flying by. It was all CGI'd, so that didn't leave them no issues with trying to get it done. But if it was pre that time, where it would have been much harder and much more expensive, The Dark Knight was however many $1 million to just to get produced. So, the other thing from the beginning that was not included was some dialogue from General Devereaux, the guy that Bruce Willis plays, and in this whole time, in the actual film, he just seems like kind of a looming figure. He's nearby. He's, I guess implied to be the boss, but he doesn't say very much. Well, in the original script, he tells the Sheik after capturing him, quote, "Nobody knows you're here. Not your people, not even my president. You'll die here alone and be buried unknown, barring some miracle." And the Sheik, he speaks a few words in Arabic, and Devereaux says, "God, God." And he's like, "What you eat, whether you eat, sleep, pain, absence of pain, I decide. I make the day and the night, even the way you got here. A hand that reached down from the sky. God, I am your new God." So that whole line, all those lines were not included at all, and it really gives a much sharper edge to Devereaux in terms of the political nature of what he's doing here, along with anything that might be implied as security type stuff. And I think, and that theme continues for the rest of the film, that there's a lot of non-PC things that he says about that, and so I think that's what they were going for, is they wanted to trim the general back, make him a little less fashy, a little less bootlicking than he actually was.
Well, I found it weird because that's literally like the first scene, once you have the kidnapping, and then you just see the general and the sheikh in the cell, and they don't say anything.
Yeah,
And it made me think, oh, they must have cut something out here, because this looks like it was set up to have a conversation.
definitely. And as you see the story progress, when we get to them capturing and torturing that guy, there's more that surrounds that event as well that they didn't include. The other thing from the opening of the movie that we have to mention is that in the very opening scenes, even before the kidnapping, there are interspliced little news clips of President Clinton talking very broadly and vaguely about terrorism. And then it also includes some footage of the Khobar Towers bombing that happened in Saudi Arabia. Now, the script actually mentions like that it was a fictional thing, that the bombing that they're trying to connect this to was not actually Khobar Towers. It was just a included fictional bombing, but that's what ended up getting used to kind of lead people in the beginning of the movie. All this imagery of blown up building. They call it the army barracks. It was a barracks, and it housed Air Force personnel that were working for Southcom, doing the no-fly zone over Iraq and other places. So then we get more into the movie. We have a bus blow up that actually doesn't blow up because the guys used paint bombs instead of actual bombs. But it's clear that they were doing some kind of test run. They probably wanted to see what the police response, the federal government response was going to be, what it looked like. Hold on, let me find my next point here. They find a guy through the INS who had smuggled some money in and got caught. It was under the $10,000 cash limit, and it comes out later that he was a mule, that he was providing someone's dowry to them, that it had nothing to do with financing terrorists or criminal organizations of any kind. But they let him go, trying to track down the bigger fish, so to speak. And the FBI watches him, and they watch as a CIA van, as some contractors or whoever it is that are working with the CIA snatch him up in broad daylight in Brooklyn, which the movie never really... Oh, go ahead, man.
Something that caught my eye when I was watching that part when they were tailing him was the fact that Tony Shalhoub's character says, like, oh, if we could listen, then we would, if we could listen in on them, then we could hear what they were saying. And it was weird. It was like, because it's funny, somebody who's worked in the intelligence community post 9/11, trying to see the way that things worked pre 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is really funny, interesting for me to see like, oh, like they didn't have surveillance because there was a law against that. And then now post Patriot Act, that's fucking like nothing.
Yeah.
And I thought it was funny how it's like they're kind of trying to make the case that, like, oh, we shouldn't impede law enforcement's ability to do what they need to do.
No, to me, they very much set up this scene as kind of the beginning of a FBI, CIA back and forth in terms of who are the good government guys versus the bad government guys when it eventually comes out to the military. And this whole scene, that they go to the house, they arrest everybody that's in the CIA safe house, including the guy that they were after. And Elise, this is their, actually I think this is their second meeting because she had showed up at an evidence spot before. And Hub just takes him in. He just did. These are my callers. These guys are under arrest. To him, it seemed entirely non-essential that they were CIA. He didn't mind. It didn't seem like he minded any of the dust that man ended up getting kicked up out of that situation. Then we move to the second bus, which Hub and Elise and Frank Haddad, played by Tony Shalhoub in this one. Actually, it's important that we mention him because they say that he is Lebanese, and he makes numerous mentions about fighting with is either Israel or fighting with Hamas. That mentions about what their people did to my village in '75, which I think was part of the first Intifada. I'm not specific about that, but so anyways, Elise, Hub, and Frank get called to another bus bombing, another bus that has been taken hostage by terrorists. And so they're getting themselves set up, all the different assets coming in, talk about calling in the bomb squad and calling in SWAT and calling in hostage negotiators. And Elise suddenly freaks out as she realizes that the bombers were waiting for the cameras, that they wanted everybody watching. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this felt really hokey to me, because do most terrorists wait for the media to be in a good filming position before they blow something up? It would be kind of an odd choice, but the effect is going to be the same, whether it was all on the media or it all happened afterwards and they're only filming the aftermath. So
Honestly,
go ahead.
yeah, yeah, that felt pretty tenuous to me as well. Is that like as soon as the helicopter, TV helicopter, turns up, all right, now we're in serious trouble. That's not really how these things work. In the history of terrorism, there is very, very few instances of the terrorists prior to carrying out whatever form of attack, whether they're storming an embassy or blowing up a bus or whatever it may be, waiting for TV cameras to show up. And it doesn't matter.
No.
It really doesn't, because
in some ways it could be better that it's not filmed, which means that they're able to propagandize it in ways that they couldn't, because that part would be on film.
Exactly.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, as you know, I wrote a book and made a couple of YouTube documentaries about the London bombings of 2005. 3 of those were on underground trains, no video footage whatsoever of them. And the 4th was on a bus, and that was apparently never captured on CCTV. There is no footage of it. There is only pictures and video of the aftermath. And that was visually, the whole bus bombing thing especially was extraordinarily effective, because people are so familiar with those buses, and people, every single intelligence-based or terrorist-based TV show since that bombing has had some sort of, flashy intro sequence that includes a London bus. That has become the visual symbol of kind of terrorism in this country, if you like. But it wasn't on camera. No one caught it on camera. They didn't announce that they were going to blow up this bus and then wait until ITN turned up before actually pulling the bus. That's just not how it works. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
So then the next thing was also pretty hokey to me too. So Hub has, they're, like I said, they're getting all of their assets set up to deal with this bombing. And Hub is trying to talk to the bombers, and Frank is there translating. So there's somebody actually speaking in Arabic, sharing everything that Hub says. And so they're not saying anything. I don't think in the entire scene that they say anything on the radio back to Hub. It's all just silence. And so Hub asks them to let the kids go. There's a number, I'd say at least half a dozen, maybe more, young children on the bus. And he asked them if they would let the kids go. Just kind of that initial hostage negotiator. I'm going to try to get something small, see how they'll react and everything. And they end up doing that. They end up letting the kids go, and the kids run back into the arms of SWAT team and the police officers on the scene. And so the next thing Hub does is he offers himself in place of the hostages. He says, you let these people go and I will take their place. That way you don't have to worry about bathroom runs or wanting pizza for people to eat. No issues. I don't know about you guys, but the idea of a single FBI agent offering his life in exchange for all these hostages felt very John McClane, Jack Bauer-esque. It really that doesn't happen in real life. It's a nice visual for us, okay, cool, he's willing to sacrifice himself to save these people, but there's no practicality to it. Our terrorists really going to do that? They're going to let all these hostages go and take this one FBI agent and think that they're on equal footing still. And so they don't say anything, and then Hub asks them to let go of the elderly people. There's some older people on the bus, and same with the kids. Can you please let these older people go? They don't, you don't need them. And they open the doors, and the elderly people start going, and it's right then when the bus blows up, and I mean blows up. I actually felt that was, as far as them showing the scene after the initial blast and everything, I thought that they did a pretty good job with that, with the exception of Hub. That Hub was close enough to the blast that it should have done some really severe damage to him, at the very least temporary deafness. But he lays there for a minute. Frank runs over and helps him up, and he gets up, which it wouldn't happen with how close he was to the bomb. And that was another place where they cut a part out of the script, that a short time after this in the original script, Hub is at his apartment taking a shower, and it's showing him washing his hair, and out of his hair is coming drops of blood and little bits of broken glass. Now, that's an effective visual. That's how close he was. There's blood, there's bits of glass, there's something really meaningful to that. But that entire thing just gets pushed off to the side. And there's some other, he has some other smaller injuries, and you see him messing with them at different times. He's giving a really loud briefing, and his nose starts to bleed, and those are good inclusions. But the shower thing could have really solidified how dangerous it was, and that he didn't escape it as much as he seemed like he would have.
Honestly, this whole bus bombing sequence, I felt, it's kind of a letdown, because the film up until that point is really quite solid and well done and well paced, and looks good and everything. And then they have this whole thing, and I mean, firstly, like a lot of people who grew up watching movies in the 1990s, as soon as I hear there's a bomb on the bus, I think, quick, better call Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock.
Sweet.
Yeah. And of course it goes horribly wrong, so maybe they should have, but bit of a casting mistake maybe in this movie. But more seriously, the whole way in which he's communicating with these apparent terrorists on this bus is through the Lebanese character, the FBI agent, the one who's blatantly based on Ali Soufan.
Yeah.
And for the first part of that scene, every time Denzel Washington says something, is it Tony Shalhoub? Is that his name?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He repeats it in presumably Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Denzel wanders away from the protective kind of cloak of the police cars and the blockade that they've set up, and he's just talking into the radio on himself, we never see the other guy translating anything. And it felt like a really desperate attempt to go, look how heroic Denzel Washington's character is.
Yeah.
Right.
And but it meant the scene kind of fell apart at that point, because the whole thing here is like he's supposed to be adopting the more peaceful, tactical, negotiating approach. He's not just sending the SWAT guys in or shooting them or whatever. And bizarrely, the message of the scene seems to be, actually, we shouldn't negotiate because it doesn't work anyway.
Yeah.
So that undermines their attempt to heroize that approach and that character. And then you have the thing where the actual explosion goes off, which is done quite realistically. It looks quite like an actual explosion in a lot of ways. But I'm like, doesn't he want to go and get checked for internal injuries or something? Isn't it, this guy's just been, I mean, he's only about, maybe 30, 40 meters away when this very powerful, high explosive goes off. But no, we just see him in the next scene. He's giving his briefing.
Yeah.
And he gets a nosebleed.
That's it.
Superman.
But you know what I mean? That's the scene where they're trying to establish the threat. The terrorists are a serious, dangerous threat. But it's okay because you can be within, 30, 40 feet of their bombs going off, and all you'll get is a nosebleed. I mean, it was so confused, that scene. This is where what I mean about the film being kind of brilliant but also terrible is that the premise is great. It's a high concept thriller, and it really delivers on its concept. It really pushes that concept to places that you wouldn't normally expect a film to go to. But some of its execution and delivery is so cheesy and poorly planned out. And I don't know what the, technical advisors and people on this film were doing with some of this stuff, because it's just like, you would never do it that way. That just wouldn't happen. You would never attempt something like that. It's so bizarre in that respect. And that sequence in particular is where that part of the movie really kicks off, that tension between we're aiming high, but our execution and our actual knowledge of how the world works isn't, it doesn't meet up with, it doesn't get to the same heights as our ambitions in this film.
Well, something that bothered me too is, you get to the bombing, or you get to the when they get to the scene, Elise says to them, it's like, all right, there's no good options here. This is a lose-lose situation. Do you want to lose a lot, or do you want to lose small? And by that, she means shoot the people who are in the way so that they can kill the terrorists instead of like letting them blow the bus up. And they just kind of gloss over that. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, no, like this is really indicative of showing the difference between their characters, right? Like Elise is part of the gray world of the CIA, and Hub has like, he has his morals and his like rah law enforcement shit. And like, that was really important, I felt, to bring that up. But then they just kind of like gloss over it, and it happens anyways.
Yeah, I felt from the earlier scene where Hub and his FBI agents take over, or do a raid on the CIA safe house, that they're drawing that very specific line with Hub being the good guy, and Elise being, like you said, of the gray world of the intelligence community. And you can see that as the movie progresses, that they really they wanted to, even if only momentarily, take the CIA down a little bit in terms of what they were offering here. But you can really see that hero notion that they wanted to put on Hub, and it continues for the whole movie. He is the leader's leader throughout the rest of the film.
I feel like this movie is more about Elise than like anybody. Honestly, I mean, she's the one that touches on all the pieces and all the characters, and like, yeah. I mean, and as we go on, like, I mean, we'll talk more about that, but it's just like all of the questions and like the stuff that just never really gets answered about, what are we doing in the Middle East? Like, what does the CIA's role mean? Like, does it make things better or not? And they never answer any of those questions.
See, I think that the original script wanted to ask more harder questions of Elise's character as it went on, and some of those were hemmed down as they went along. But it was definitely wanting to push, that Leo over intelligence community as far as the story went. But you're right, though, is that she did touch everything in the movie, which they mentioned at the very beginning of the film about how the CIA is not allowed to operate domestically. Yet, for the rest of the film, Hub doesn't bother Elise about that he knows she's a member of the CIA, and there she is in his office wearing an office badge, doing investigative work that is absolutely illegal for her to be doing. And we never hear anything about, oh, the president authorized this, or some other DOD or intelligence community figure said, fine, send this person or let them do what they do. But it's just not mentioned again. It's just entirely avoided.
No, sure. This CIA officer who they suspect of having some kind of covert relationship with the very terrorists that they're hunting is somehow allowed to inveigle her way into the criminal investigation into those terrorists.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Even though the CIA isn't actually supposed to be legally allowed to do any of this.
None.
Even if that situation was in itself somehow plausible, which it isn't, although it does actually still, it does happen. I'm just saying it's like, that sounds ridiculous on its face. on top of that, you have the fact that the CIA is, at least on paper, not allowed to do any of this at all. I know what you mean, Kagan. She is the most interesting character in the story.
Yeah.
And what she's up to is the most interesting thing in the story. Because after a while, you kind of get bored of Denzel Washington doing the same thing Denzel Washington does in every movie, where he plays the, sort of intelligent, diplomatic guy who it's almost like his voice and his ability to speak is his superpower. And you're more like wondering, I kind of want to know what Elise is doing right now. I'm kind of got bored of listening to this guy saying the same thing scene after scene. Can we find out a little bit more about what's going on with her? And as you say, it sort of poses these questions, not as hard as it could pose them, but they do come up, but they're just left hanging. It's like just like Homeland in that respect.
Yeah.
All of these same questions come up at some point quite explicitly in dialogue in episodes of Homeland, but no one ever fucking answers them. No one ever actually says, the reality is the CIA is effectively a secret society crossed with a criminal organization masquerading as a security agency.
Yep.
Which is like the most accurate one-line description I can really give of them, to be honest. And I'm still waiting, after years and years, as you know, of watching every movie about the CIA I can possibly get my hands on. I'm still waiting for one to actually just say that, like, bluntly. And this film evades answering those questions in the exact same way as so many of the more recent products. In fact, I mean, watching it, I was kind of impressed by just how much it looks and feels like a modern spy thriller. It has aged in some ways really rather well.
Yeah.
And in other ways, really not so much. But
well,
Henry,
it
I'll
just
let you
makes me sad, like that. I mean, just when you look at it with context, because I remember watching this when it came out and just being like, I was a kid, so I was like, oh, cool. But then, like, when you watch it, like, post 9/11 and just seeing the way that, like, everything that we've done, how much it's changed, and, like, especially how much the American psyche has changed, it's just sad to see how, like, I mean, people who would be, like, calling these, like, asking these questions, there's a lot of people now that don't even care to ask those questions.
Yeah.
So we move on to the fallout from the bombing, which the FBI goes to work, and they're guys sleeping in offices and working all hours of the night. They end up finding a severed finger of one of the bombers, and they identify him as a Palestinian, that he came from Ramallah in the West Bank, and that he was also on the terrorist watch list. And the movie clearly, points out is how was he able to get into the country? And then they find out that it was a student visa, which was given by the guy they find next, but they don't. That's another thing that they never return to, is they bring up the question of how did this guy get in the country, but it's never concretely established how he actually did, if there was any attempt to cross-check him with the terrorist watch list, if there was anything else done, or it was just that this guy signed a student visa and that was all he needed. And kind of pull the thread on exactly how easy is it for quote unquote these people to get into the United States. And so they I think feel like they really left that to the viewer over having something concrete. Be like, okay, we found this particular hole in doing the watch list, because it just because, and I'm not a fan of the terrorist watch list, but just because there's a problem with one part doesn't mean that the rest of it does not actually do that. I'm sure the terrorist watch list has probably saved us a time or two. I don't have any specific proof of that, but again, a broken clock is right twice a day.
I will say, in the sequence where the token Asian American lady in the FBI office is giving that little briefing about the visa, and
Yes.
explaining that first. You will notice on the whiteboard behind her, when she's talking about, well, how did he get this visa? Who sponsored this visa? The name CIA is written with a big circle drawn around it. And I have a feeling that may have been the production crew having a little, like, maybe
little fun.
rebellion, perhaps, because it's kind of heavily implied, you know, there must have been some kind of CIA shenanigans going on that got this guy into the country. But like you say, in terms of the plot, it's just sort of dropped. It's left hanging like so much is. And I
Yeah.
have a feeling that may have been just a tiny little, they weren't standing for that. They were going to stick a big signpost in there for anyone who cared to look as to,
Nice.
you know, what's really should have been said here.
Well, they immediately following that, they go and find Samir, who is another one of the. He's a at this point in the film, he's just he's a professor at Brooklyn College, and he seems, you know, quite innocent and unassuming when they first start to, you know, they talk to him and shove him in the back of a cop car, and he's talking to Frank, which means that there's a cultural understanding, or at least association there, that the other agents wouldn't particularly have. Samir actually calls Frank a woman. It had to. I was trying to remember the specific reference. He's like, you were part of this. You were. It wasn't Hamas, or it was some other, I think, want to say Palestinian thing. And Samir is like, no, but the only guys I know who didn't were women like you. And obviously it pisses Frank off a lot, and he actually hits Samir. But you know, there's another there's the connotation of men and women in Muslim societies is very different than ours. And calling another Arab man a woman, I would imagine that is I mean, we as, you know, American dudes take horrible offense to that, even if it's true. But I think that there's an additional layer there for Frank because of where Frank comes from. He was born in Lebanon, and then eventually got a visa to come to the U.S. Let's see. And then in the scene after, Hub tells him he'll have Frank's badge if he hits someone again. And Frank says that one of these days I will tell you the horrible things that his people did to my village in 75. Like I mentioned earlier, I want to say that I think that was during the first Intifada. But I need to double check that. But there's a definite kind of connection here they want to make. You know, Frank, if Frank's the good Muslim, that okay, well, the good Muslim came and joined our team, and he's talking about the horrible things that somebody connected to Samir does, and it's just kind of adding those little threads again without much context, without much any follow up or anything. Then we move forward a little bit, and General Devereaux, that we met earlier in the movie, is in Hub's office, and they, you know, they both know who each other is, and Hub mentions that he's a veteran of the 82nd Airborne, which, of course, General Devereaux, as a general, said, yeah, he said I was commanding the 173rd at the time when Hub was in 82nd. So now we have a veteran meet cute, if we want to call it that. But in terms of, you know, it changes the dynamics here, because understanding that somebody is a fellow veteran and attaching their service together, it changes that. It's kind of like the cultural thing I mentioned earlier with Frank and Samir, is that we you know, those different connections that we make with people without really making them with anyone.
Yeah, there's a certain bond of understanding of some sort.
Yeah. And Hub mentioned something about President Clinton being concerned about terrorism. I'm saying President Clinton because that was the frames they used earlier in the movie. I don't remember the word Clinton coming out of anybody's mouth through the whole movie. They did reference the president, but not Clinton specifically. And
they also sort of vaguely reference the Lewinsky scandal at one point. It's pretty clear that the president is Clinton.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, but at least they had that separation, that they could imply it without broadcasting it to the heavens. Um, and then Hub and Devereaux have a pretty easygoing conversation about using troops on the ground there. Devereaux asks him if he's chasing his tail. Um, and then Elise comes in, and Elise sees Devereaux, and there's also a bit of a changing of the guard there, because I'm guessing Elise had no idea that Devereaux was involved in any of this until he saw his grinning face. And so there's they kind of break up from there. Then the FBI, they get a tip on a possibility for the remaining terrorists of the cell. They have to get a warrant, which was another omission from the original script. The original script had 2 very short cutscenes that involved Hub talking to a federal judge, and that would have really helped demonstrate his resolve in terms of trying to do his job, while the judge, who did give him significant pushback, the judge mentioned a comment like that black people have committed a whole lot of violence in this city during the last 20 years. But if an officer of the law was to come into my courtroom and tell me that they wanted to take all African Americans from a particular area and put them in a stadium, of course I would say, fuck no. And I feel like that removal, it really kind of streamlined that whole process. A lot of people don't understand that sometimes it takes a huge amount of immense work to get a warrant, to write all the affidavits, to have all the appropriate information, and then to convince the judge. And I think that would have showed Hub's character in a different way if you saw him negotiating with or trying to convince this judge, versus it being a streamlined thing where we need a warrant. Oh, we don't have the warrant. Oh, hey, we got the warrant. And that's it. There's no other understanding of what happened other than that.
It's also, in terms of like the, I don't know quite what word to use, the ideological dialogue that's going on in the subtext of this movie, it also would have presented a bit of more of that, of actual pushback against that. Not in terms of how it depicts the American institutions and everything, but in terms of the themes for the audience. That you actually have to have that argument and that dialogue for people to understand what's at stake here. At what point does the government have a right to violate someone's privacy, spy on them, tap their phone, whatever it may be? Most people would agree there comes a point at which that is justified. But it's so rare that we actually hear the arguments, even around a specific case like in this, where it's, one very particular group of people they're trying to spy on. In order for people to think those things through, and in order for people to understand what's at stake for them in the real world, you actually have to have that dialogue on screen. And so taking it out, which may have been for story reasons or may have been for political reasons or maybe a bit of both, means that it just seems like, it's just a standard thing. We don't have to worry about how the FBI get warrants to spy on people. It's just a normal thing, background stuff, doesn't really matter. And also the sequence where Elise and Denzel Washington's character, whose name I can never remember, they're walking through, as far as I can tell, the very apartment block where this terrorist cell are, the very people that they're supposed to be spying on, basically having a discussion about them as they walk up the stairs. Quite a loud discussion about them. And then when they get to the top, Frank is sat there and he's got the warrant in his hand. That's terrible tradecraft.
Oh, obvious. Oh, yes. That's horrible.
It's like those sequences where you see people walking through CIA headquarters having a conversation about whatever top secret thing they're working on, and they're surrounded by like 36 people who could overhear them. And you just think that's not how you would do these things. Again, where were the technical advisors to stop them from doing this like horrendously stupid thing? Because these are supposed to be crack FBI agents, right? These are supposed to be kind of our heroes. They're the clever guys who are going to somehow fix this problem. And again, it totally undermines that by having them do something hilariously stupid. This film just doesn't know where it's at half the time.
No, it's That is one that does really bother me. Another one, and this comes up in a lot of movies, not just The Siege, but one that I noticed really blatantly in this one, that as the FBI SWAT team is making their way up that staircase that you just described after the loud conversation, that there's 5 or 6 agents in full SWAT gear, and then you have Hub and Frank pulling up the rear, and they're wearing nice monographed FBI vests and holding their pistols, but they give the impression like they're there to kind of back the SWAT team up, and that's not what really happens in real life. The SWAT team is the SWAT team. They have their members and they use them. However, if there's something that needs to get changed, that's one thing. But the boss coming in at the end of the trail, at the end of the stack of guys about to kick in the door, yeah, that doesn't happen in real life. The boss stays outside until it's safe, and then once it's safe, then they go in and deal with whatever's going on. I did want to mention one real quick thing about the judge while I was thinking about it. The other thing about their failure to include those cutscenes with him, it would have given another American official the open and welcome duty of saying that Muslim lives, Arab lives, Palestinian lives, Iraqi lives mean as much as ordinary Americans, because that was very in the script part I read, that was very much implied, and that's something that we don't see very often in movies, and in other places in this movie they kind of gloss over that. But if that had happened, it would have been like, wow, this judge actually cares that these cops, that if they're going after Americans, they're going after Americans. Doesn't matter what they look like, doesn't matter who they pray to. These people's lives have meaning. And by not including that was another way that they could have solidified that line.
Sure. It's another way of presenting the Muslim characters in this movie, pretty much all of whom are terrorists.
Yes, pretty much.
As this kind of alien other thing that somehow invaded America, that somehow, here without being properly American, and therefore shouldn't be subject to the same, civil rights and the same legal protections and so on as the rest of us. There is very much an us and them mentality as this movie goes on. Even though it kind of criticizes that, it still reinforces it in so many ways. And you're absolutely right, having that section with the judge ripped out of there, that's the prime opportunity to actually have that conversation and actually make that point. So yes, that may also be one of the reasons why that was removed.
Yeah, absolutely. So we move on to the theater bombing. So the
just
crew...
before you get into that, can we talk a little bit about the SWAT raid?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, go for it.
Firstly, I love how the character playing low rent Mark Rossini in this film is the same guy who plays Richie Aprile in The Sopranos a few years later. Because the notion of him working for the FBI just makes me laugh. I loved the thing with the pizza box and the no contact pizza delivery. Those terrorists were very much ahead of their time in that respect. But just the sheer notion of the way we're going to storm this apartment where a bunch of terrorists who have already carried out one massively lethal bombing and therefore probably have detonators and explosive and what have you lying around in the apartment.
Yeah.
The way we're going to get in there is by putting a grenade in a pizza box. And then run in and just shoot everything.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Yep. That's all it is. Yeah.
Like, I'm amazed they didn't just blow themselves up. Frankly, I'm amazed anyone came out of that room alive.
Well, and like they just go in there, they just basically start shooting, and also to the two guys who were in the front of the stack, you see them later working with the task force as like regular agents, and so I'm like, that's also another weird thing that would never happen, but okay.
Yeah, the lack of injuries from the FBI agents seemed really suspicious to me. You had at least 2 of the guys in the apartment had AKs, meaning that their rounds could potentially penetrate whatever armor the FBI guys were wearing.
Yep.
I don't think that you kick in the door, like you mentioned about, of 3 terrorists who, if they had blown themselves up, would have been entirely on point for this kind of situation. But they didn't blow themselves up. The FBI walked into a hail of nasty gunfire, which somebody should have come away with at least a scratch of some kind, and they didn't. All the FBI guys were 100%, with the 3 terrorist guys being dead. And so it really ties that up way too succinctly as just a good action scene over, well, I don't know about good action, an action scene over anything else that could be more realistic. It would have made more sense, and I know this would be horrific to see, but like somebody standing out on the street, an FBI agent securing the perimeter or something, and all of a sudden that whole corner of the building blows up, like their apartment, and it's just all cut out from right there. That would have made some kind of sense, especially in the way that in the abilities that these terrorists have shown. But instead, we get this very tight and neat little SWAT scene with nobody getting hurt.
Except for the 3 terrorists who
Oh,
are
excuse
me.
conveniently
3 dead terrorists. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, of course. There got to be dead terrorists. It's just part of what we do.
Well, and wouldn't you do something like, I mean, I don't work for an intelligence or a law enforcement agency, but the way I would approach something like that is wait for one of the guys to leave the apartment so that you can then grab him up. So you've at least got one person to
Exactly.
interrogate after
Yeah.
this.
Exactly. Like they should
maybe-
have nabbed one person and then if they had to take the other ones, but like fuck. Yeah, it's just so stupid. It's like they came there to get information because they suspected that that's where they were. And so, yeah, they've got physical evidence and they've got the bombs and stuff, but like having somebody who can then link everything together, like that would have been priority number 1.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just fucking stupid that they just were like, oh, we killed everyone. Okay, bye, whatever.
And then also there's the terrorist little piggy, bomb making bank that they have there of stuff. And so it'd be between that and the rest of the scene, it really gives this immediate but false sense of completion. And so and then they go out, the agents go out and celebrate. It seems very much that they have done what they needed to do. And then in the course of them being out, they all get paged and they find out that a theater somewhere, I want to say it was somewhere in Manhattan, but I'm not sure about the specific borough.
It looks like Broadway, like they're in Times Square.
Yeah,
and
it
stuff, so-
looks like it's definitely up there in upscale Manhattan. And that had the most graphic part of the movie in my view, which was there was a lady who was walking down the stairs and she turns in the camera and you see that she has a severed arm and she's holding that severed arm with her other hand. That is the most specific bomb related violence that we see. So I thought about that with the earlier bus bombing, and it's like, if this was a legitimate terrorist bombing of a bus full of innocent people, there would be body parts.
Yeah, everywhere.
On the street, on the walls, on the everything. And again, American movies movies period, we can't usually show such explicit violence, but that is the reality we'd be looking at. And this woman walking down the stairs, I think, was the closest that they actually came to it by showing that. I mean, it was just her holding an arm. It wasn't, there wasn't particularly graphic and like there were tendons or ligaments hanging out or anything like that. But it was the biggest statement they made in terms of the violence.
And it comes immediately after possibly the dumbest moment in the entire movie when a whole team of FBI agents drunk drive at high speed through a crowded city.
They do. I forgot about that. You mentioned that before.
Towards a bomb site.
Yep.
What could go wrong?
Yep. And that's
Especially because Elise was like, "Oh, I'm wasted," and then they go to the fucking scene, and I'm like, "Oh
Yep.
yeah, this is so great."
Yeah, we've now got a drunken CIA officer who's sleeping with a terrorist running around our bomb scene.
Right. No, that was awful. At the very least, you could see them being drunk in a cab, and they're like, they pay the cabbie extra money, go faster, go faster, go faster. But to drive there themselves, that's something, you know. But again, because of the nature of the movie, it's immediately forgotten because now we have this theater blow up scene and everything that just came before, you know, the semi normalcy we return to, getting drunk after the big bust. It just totally shifts back to that without explaining very much how it shifted back to that. Um, so then we move on. There's a briefing that Hub gives to a bunch of other law enforcement agencies. There's a gentleman there who says he works for the Arab Anti-Defamation League, that I thought that was actually a good inclusion, that they his mentioning that the Arab community of New York City stands with them, stands with law enforcement. They do decry this horrible violence. I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially, you know, what he said there. And then after he gets done, Hub kind of gets into this, you know, rah kind of speech. He mentions about a bombing in Tel Aviv, which was, if I got the timeline right, was the Dizengoff Street bus bombing. It was a Hamas suicide attack on a passenger bus in Tel Aviv in 1994. 22 civilians were killed and 50 were injured. But he mentions that, you know, that the day after Tel Aviv, the market was open and it was full. And it's like, what the hell is that supposed to mean exactly? That people have to go on even if other people they knew or lived close to just got blown up? Yeah, that's reality. That's what it is. So making it seem like, wow, all of these people just went on with their lives, no problem. Bomb, we just keep on trucking. He even mentions towards the very end, this is New York City. We can take it. You know, we're putting John McClane credentials on all of New York City now. They can take it. They can handle the big booms and everything. So then they move on to which was the next thing? Was it One Federal Plaza, or was it the thing with the kids at the school?
The kids in the terrorist guy holding the kids hostage.
So we have a more traditional hostage negotiation type scene. Hub and Frank and a couple other FBI agents are just beyond a set of barricades that whoever's inside had set up, and they're using trying to think of the term, the flex cameras, the little
those cameras that go around corners, whatever.
Yeah, little snake, the snake ones, the ones that they use to see different things. And Elise is there with them as well. And at one point, without really, I don't remember there being any dialogue between the characters right now, the news helicopters show up again. And Elise just kind of looks forlornly at Hub, and, you know, it's all subtext. There's no specifics here at all. And Hub decides, and I mean this entirely without jest, he goes freaking John McClane. He runs down this hallway. He busts open the double doors with his shoulder. He does a combat roll, and then he shoots this one terrorist, which I know that, but the scene immediately before that, they weren't sure how many of them there were yet. They knew there was one they could see, but there could have been more in places they couldn't have seen. So he was actively doing that into a place where they didn't have all the information yet anyway,
right,
regardless if they could do anything about it. But he does his nice little combat roll, puts 3 rounds center mass on the terrorist, and down he goes. No mention of how dumb it was. No mention of the idea that guy could have had a what do they call a dead man trigger?
Yeah, dead man's trigger.
You know, and again, that could have easily been another cratered apartment on the side of a building. But thanks to his good, you know, his John McClane-ness, you know, that didn't happen. But again, there's no explanation, no understanding of, you know, why it was that had to be done at that exact moment, and the immense danger that he put everyone in doing that.
Definitely my least favorite scene in the movie. Just the most like outrageous, ridiculous of, we gotta go save those kids right now. Like nothing else matters. And it's just like fucking bullshit. Like, yeah, all those things you just said. Nobody knows the entire situation. They don't know how many people there are.
No.
Yeah. It's just so like, oh, let me just go in and do the action hero thing. Not like we haven't seen that enough in this movie.
Right.
Also, it undermines, thematically speaking, it undermines what this movie appears to be trying to say, which is that the diplomatic, negotiating, law enforcement approach to terrorism is better than the militarized approach. That's sort of supposed to be the whole lesson of the conflict in the second half of the movie between General John McClane and Denzel Washington. Yet here, we see him doing the exact opposite. He is supposed to be the intelligent one. He is supposed to be the careful, patient one who's, going to think this through and try and find a way to resolve this peacefully. And yet he's the one we see, like you say, cartwheeling down a fucking corridor before shooting a terrorist. And again, of course, no Muslims said anything of any significance in this part of the movie. They're not given a voice. We don't know why this guy is doing this. We don't even know if he's part of the same terrorist cells that did the other things.
Yeah, no, we're completely in the dark. All right, so we then move on to this council type scene with a whole bunch of federal and state officials sitting around this giant round table discussing what is happening in New York City, and that they're trying to have some kind of consensus for the president. That I don't know if he's coming to New York, coming back to Washington, but they're trying to figure out what it is they're going to do, because at this moment they've finally arrived at their breaking point, that this is too much, and now they have to push for military action. And so Devereaux gives a whole speech here, which I'm going to read, and then we can make fun of it because it's awful. But just prior to them doing that, they did a really quick flash cut out of that scene, and it shows water being poured over hands in a ritualized manner, and on the speaker we hear the sound of chanting. This is one of those inclusions in terms of trying to make it seem like it's about Muslim people without anybody in the movie actually saying it's about Muslim people. Just these little spots in there. And so the chief of staff, the one that's going to be reporting to the president, asked Devereaux what it would look like in terms of them bringing in the army. And Devereaux says, quote, 12 hours after the president gives the word, we can be on the ground. One light infantry division of 10,700 men. Elements of the Rapid Deployment Force combined with Special Forces, APCs, tanks, helicopters, and of course, the ubiquitous M16A1 assault rifle. A humble weapon until you see a man carrying one outside your local bowling alley or 7-Eleven. It will be noisy, it will be scary, and it will not be mistaken for a VFW parade. Then, right at the end of that line, they go back to another anonymous thing. Anonymous hands lifting a cotton shroud. And then here's something that wasn't included in the movie. Devereaux says, that means civilian casualties. At a minimum, it's a drunk private joyriding in a Hummer who runs down an old lady in Greenport. At a maximum, and then he trails off. And then he says, make no mistake, we will hunt the enemy, we will find the enemy, and we will kill the enemy. And no card-carrying member of the ACLU is more dead set against it than I am, which is why I urge you, no, I implore you, do not consider this option. Now, number one, no general is going to be a member of the ACLU. In any country, in any place, none of them. Their existence as a general, it would make absolutely no sense. Also, I felt like he was kind of egging them on here. Like he was kind of saying, you don't want this, you don't want this. I'm telling you, you don't want this. And everyone else in the room is like, yeah, we kind of want this, even after you saying all your scary things.
Because what's the next line? The national security advisor is like, that's why you're the best person for this job.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that they generals can be remarkably PC when they want to be. depending on the situation. Now, there's another line that comes up just a little bit later. They're still in this council room, and a different general, I'm assuming the Army Chief of Staff or somebody else high up in that, he says, "I remind you, General Devereaux does not speak for official Army policy. A police function has become accepted as our role in Haiti, in Somalia." Yeah, Haiti and Somalia are destroyed. We didn't do anything good there whatsoever. I'm calling it a
Yeah,
police.
that didn't work out well for Haiti
No,
and
it did not
Somalia.
work out well for Haitians or the Somalis in the least. But it kind of gave, there's a little bit of PC cover there in terms of, okay, he's a little overzealous. That's not official Army policy, but he still gets the job. He's still the guy that they send there. That doesn't tell the general, it's like, wow, this dude is really going to, do horribly here. I don't know that we want to have him actually do it. Our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters, helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out our honorary producers, and they are Will Lorenz, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Zach H., Ren Jacob, Howard Reynolds, Why I Am Anti-War, Kenneth Cordasco, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our awesome store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
Well, this goes back to what you were saying about what was cut out of that opening scene where they capture the Sheikh.
Mm-hmm.
When I first watched this film, I was confused as to whether is the general genuinely opposed to this policy, or is this whole spiel he gives at the council a bunch of reverse psychology to ensure he gets the job and they adopt this policy? Because you have that whole thing about, if we're going to do this, we want someone who doesn't really want to do it to actually implement it, because then it won't go overboard and it won't start, unnecessarily infringing on people's liberties and so on and so forth. But he then goes, like, when he actually gets to implement this, he goes full Colonel Kurtz and starts fucking locking everyone up, killing people, doing whatever the hell he likes. He just reveals himself to be a psychopath. So I was kind of left wondering, are they trying to say it's because he was thrust into this impossible situation that he went crazy? Or are they trying to say this was his plan all along? And it seems from the early script that you've read, Henry, they were trying to say this was his plan all along. And
that way, yeah.
And that this is false opposition to the policy, and he's just saying that so he comes across as the sort of guy that you would put in charge of it because he's not going to, go overboard with it.
Yeah.
But because they don't really set that up earlier in the film, at this point, I was just kind of deeply confused with what does this guy actually believe and what is he even trying to do here? It's another one of those places where they seemed to be trying to do something quite high concept, but miserably failed in the execution on the one hand, and also these changes to the script meant it was just much less clear what the hell they were even trying to say.
Yeah, there's another cut from this scene just a little bit later with Hub, because the chief of staff asks him, if there's anything he wants to add, if there's what does he think that they need to do, and Hub says, quote, "Nothing. Don't overreact. With all respect, gentlemen, I'm just a cop. To you, these people may be martyrs, but to me, they're criminals. And a criminal is no better than somebody who thinks he's better than everyone else. And he's not better, he only has to be wrong once. And that's where we come in. We run down a tip from a landlord, or we pick up a latent print from a bus. Our phones are ringing off the hook with people from the Arab community wanting to help. And they love this country, and they hate these criminals are giving them a bad name. With some help and some old-fashioned shoe leather, we'll nail these guys." And that whole line in there was taken out. Hub ends up saying something about the job of the FBI is to respond, and the job of the Army is to defend. With their presence in the city, it would make it really, really hard for them to continue investigating, and you get to see that through the movie. But again, this guy's an Army veteran. He understands what it means in terms of the firepower and violence that a military unit would bring alongside. But that's not given any credence here. He's not the general with the great speech.
It sucks that they took out so many of the things that would have humanized the Arab community and like given a real persona to like empathize with, and instead that's all just taken out.
Yeah, it really is. And there's more coming. I found a whole bunch of them. So
Well, and the line in that little bit of dialogue in particular, where he's saying that, we've got people providing us information from this community because they want us to find these people and then take them off the streets. And of course, it's far easier to invade the Arab community if you can pretend like they're not doing anything to help.
Yeah.
Whether that be in, Brooklyn or Iraq.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So then they reintroduce Elise, Elise's name is now Sharon, and Sharon was doing covert work during the Gulf War in Iraq. She explains that the terrorist cells have no central leadership, that if you cut off the head, another just rises in its place, which they don't. They talk about that technique, that idea of terrorist cells, but they don't point to any specific examples or something else that somebody could credibly look at and say, okay, that kind of makes sense. It's not that she's wrong, but again, I'd like a little evidence with my evidence, and this doesn't really have any. It's then they find out that One Federal Plaza, the immense federal office building in downtown Manhattan, where their main offices got bombed, and I believe they mentioned that they had over 600 casualties, and the agents, Frank and Hub, both mentioned about all the people, this person and this person that they were in there working. When it left, it just happened to be that the guys who were out doing interviews or other stuff, Hub and Frank being at this big meeting, that it saved them, that everybody else would have been bombed and dead. So next thing. So then Hub gets after Sharon. He's very, very pissed that he hasn't gotten all this information that he should have had earlier. If she's really supposed to be some kind of CIA liaison, that should have been sharing that stuff. And he actually threatens to leak that stuff to the New York Times if he feels like Sharon is withholding. Then they pull a president is presidential by using violence. It was just before Devereaux actually takes the unit into New York that the chief of staff tells him, "I'm telling you, the president is prepared to be presidential." Well, presidential usually means violence inflicted on somebody a long ways away. That
Right.
I mean, there's nothing more to it than that. It's a bully yard thing, just written nicer. They also mentioned that the War Powers Act gave Devereaux the clearance to enter New York City. The War Powers Act doesn't have anything to do with that,
Exactly.
at all. I mean, nothing. It's a method for Congress to rein back in an unruly military operation in the event that they have enough votes, which they usually don't. I think that the recent one that they did about Yemen, it was during when Trump was still in office, is the only time that a War Powers Act resolution has ever passed either House of Congress. But they just throw it in there like, oh, people will know about that, and it has nothing to freaking do with it. And then we come to the military. They're sealing off Brooklyn. That anyone fitting their particular profile that they mentioned very specifically will be arrested and detained. The profile was, I think it was Muslim boys and men age 15 to 40, something like that. It was a pretty good swath, and then they only fitted it down to Brooklyn. So it was, I think when they say they came down to, it was like 4,500 people hiding among a population of however many tens of
It was
thousands.
he says 2,000 in a population of 2 million because it's all the people who came in the country in the last 6 months.
Oh,
So
that too.
that
Yeah,
also
I forgot
on the
about that
profile.
part. So he's essentially, we're it's broadsword time. We're here to do it, and so they set up the stadium and they start putting all of these people that they captured that fit this profile into the stadium, to include Frank's son. Frank has I think a 14 or 15-year-old son who ends up getting picked up, and Hub actually goes to the stadium and finds Frank, and Frank is beyond livid. And he discusses how he feels very, very betrayed. That how many years had he lived in the U.S., how many years had he worked for the Bureau, the things that he had sacrificed and given up, and yet here's my son in this fucking stadium. Yeah, he was, and I would, as a father, I would be beyond livid too. So they Hub goes to Devereaux about the kid, and Devereaux accuses him of questioning his patriotism. And again, we have another essentially show-stopping moment. It's not about anything that actually happens. It was enough that he said, "You're questioning my patriotism." So, oh, he's a general. I won't question his patriotism. They then capture another dude named Tariq Husseini, who I believe was where was he from? It might have been the West Bank. I can't remember at the moment. So, but when they go to pick Tariq Husseini up, because he's the FBI goes to pick him up because he's the next step in their investigation, and at the same time the army raids it, they blow up most of the building, if not the entire building. Everyone else that was in there working, to include a couple FBI agents, died, and only
Yeah.
Hub and the suspect, or the guy Tariq Husseini, they're the only ones that survived that. Oh, I missed one line earlier that I think was really important for Frank at the stadium. I jumped the stadium a little bit. It actually comes after this, but he tells them, "I'm not their sand nigger anymore." And sand nigger being a awful term that troops did use overseas in terms of calling the local population. It's like calling people Hajis. But it makes a very specific thing here that Frank knew that he's an American. He's on the side of the Americans. Now he's not their rube anymore, not their useful idiot anymore, if we want to look at it that way. Then we move on to torture time. So Elise tries to interrogate the guy Tariq. He spits in her face, which also could be another male-female interaction in terms of a woman speaking with authority to a man.
Right.
I mean, it's just yeah. I don't know that that's what it was, but it really seemed like that's what they were trying to get to. So Sharon says, "Okay, I can't get any more. What do we do now?" And Devereaux starts going through a list of different types of torture. They mention waterboarding. They mention electrocuting him. They mentioned stress positions combined with sleep deprivation. And Hub just loses his mind right there. He's like, what is this? What the hell are you guys talking about? We can't do this. We can't do that." And I thought it was one of the really good points left in, that if you torture him, General, all that we have bled and fought and died for is over. You know, if we're really buying into the American mythos that our freedoms were only won by the hard work of the military, and asking them to do something this abhorrent. And so he's just beside himself. They end up kicking him out of the room. He stands in the
One
hallway.
other thing he says as well that really struck with me was, "What if they don't even want the shake? What if this is what they want?
Yes.
The troops in the streets and people afraid in their homes and like torture." It's like that's the fucking shit. Like, yes, that
Yeah.
is the point.
Yeah.
That is the point of terrorism.
No, that I forgot about that one. That was another really good one. Um, and you see there that was a real moment of him identifying with the humanity of these people that are under attack. Is like, we can't do this. You know, it was just so effed up to him, the idea that it would have to happen under any circumstances. And so they kick him out of the room, and he essentially listens to them torture Tariq and murder him in the room. And he didn't know anything, but that didn't stop him from shooting him in the head when they were done.
Which again, like, doesn't make any sense. If your purpose is to try and get information, why
Yeah,
would
no.
you like torture someone for 2 seconds and then shoot them? Like,
Yeah, exactly. And the thing about interrogations, even non-physical interrogations, is something I used to do when I was on the drug team. They can take hours of you talking to someone. Sometimes you're spending time shooting the shit because you're trying to establish rapport, but it's not always this aggressive law and order face of, did you do this whole thing? Because people don't want to talk when you talk to them that way. They have to develop some kind of rapport, or you ain't learning shit. Um,
Well, they've got to feel that it's safe, that they can give you the information that they ultimately don't really want to give you.
yes,
But you've got
yes.
to make them feel safe in giving that up. Otherwise, like you say, you're not really going to get anything out of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is one of those wonderful moments in this film where probably the best piece of dialogue, the most intelligent piece of dialogue, and most true piece of dialogue in the whole movie,
I agree.
about maybe this is actually the whole purpose of the terrorism, is to make us start terrorizing ourselves, is followed by something outrageously dumb where, like you say, from the sound, I mean, we only hear the sound of the torture because we're out in the corridor with Hub. It's just basically sort of sounds like he sticks a knife in him and twists it for a couple of seconds and then shoots him. They don't even try to interrogate the guy. It's more just a murder than a torture session. It's very strange. I guess they did that for dramatic effect. They're trying to show how, the general's gone completely off the deep end and it's just sort of descended into insanity. But
Yeah.
just poor execution again.
Fair.
Even torture takes quite a long time.
No, and Elise even mentions, that when they were discussing different methods of torture, that doing the sleep deprivation one takes at least 36 hours. That they're in any kind of interrogation or torture, is that there's all these establishing things that need to be done to make it seem a certain way. They the spooks that were working at Abu Ghraib, that they would talk the guards there into helping them prep a prisoner. I don't know that they use that word prep, but messing with their circadian rhythms, forcing them to lay in nasty positions, things that are lesser forms of torture, but not something that is as easily proven by looking at someone. It's like, oh, this dude, he got nailed to the damn wall. But that they were definitely in line with that. So then we move on to the Hub meeting with the chief of staff, the guy who was in charge of the big meeting with all of the generals. And he gives him an accordion file. And the existing movie dialogue doesn't really specify about what is actually in the accordion file. It's just, they just give it to him. It's just a big old file of stuff. And then they talk a little bit about the Sheik, and this is all stuff that wasn't included in the movie from the chief of staff. Now, we just can't let him go. America has to stand tall in the world, yada yada yada. So what we do is we let the American justice system do its work. And Hub's like, "What do you mean, let the justice system do its work?" And the chief of staff says, "We don't release him a judge releases him. You're an FBI man. That's what judges are good at, right? It's not like we've gone after him in proper prosecutorial fashion, kidnapping him, holding him in isolation. Fruit of the poison tree. Remember that one from law school? Oh well, we'll have a big trial. Everybody will get their rocks off. But the fact is, the sheik will walk. And the last comment he makes, and this whole episode becomes nothing more than the news cycle before the next news cycle. This whole section wasn't in there at all. So there's no discussion about the sheik, about exactly where he is in the system, because this is the first, other than Devereaux scenes that don't include anybody else, this is the first admission outside of that the U.S. government knows about this guy, knows he's in custody, knows they can't charge him, knows that he will walk, but they still have him. But at least here they actually acknowledge it. They acknowledge that that was the reality.
I mean, I assumed watching this film that the Sheik character is based on the blind sheikh, Omar Abdel Rahman, the guy who was, I guess, in some ways ultimately behind the World Trade Center bombing in '93. Because there was a whole thing in the late 1990s where Al Qaeda were trying to get him released from prison. I mean, he was in a super maximum security prison.
What was his? Where was he from?
Egypt.
He's from Egypt. Yeah, Egypt isn't mentioned in this movie at all.
No. But I can only assume it's at least somewhat based on that. I mean, we are talking about.
It sounds right. Yeah.
A string of terrorist attacks in New York that are all, it seems, ultimately in some way inspired by this terrorist mastermind, although we never actually see him do anything.
No.
All he really does in the film is get captured.
We don't even see him meet with his own followers.
No. So again, it's pretty hazy and unclear, like so many things in this script. But I always thought that's what they were playing on, was that attempt that Al Qaeda were making in the late 90s to get the blind sheikh released from prison. And that's why. But there again, that doesn't make any sense. You don't start running around bombing theaters and things to demand someone's release. You might take some hostages or hijack a plane and demand that someone be released, because then you've got a negotiation, you've got an exchange. You get the plane back and everyone's safe, and we get the guy out of prison. Just simply bombing a bunch of stuff isn't going to get it done.
No.
So the rationale there doesn't really add up. And yeah, taking out that sequence, it basically leaves it like fairly ambivalent even at the end of the movie. Who was this person that they captured, and what was his connection with this subsequent terrorist campaign? Was there even a connection at all?
Yeah.
Did anyone at any point in this entire story actually understand what the hell was going on or why? And I mean that both in terms of people watching this film and the characters in this film. Because there's some real problems there. And all of these edits that you're telling me about made the film worse, not just politically worse, but also just make less sense as a movie.
Yeah, the narrative was really shifted.
And there's just so many more holes in it and so many more problems with the character arcs and things as a result. It sounds like it was a much more sort of intelligence, and I don't want to use the word balanced, but sophisticated movie to begin with. And it became considerably simplified. And as a result, they cut out anything that was sort of complicated or subtle. And the result is a movie with no complexity or subtlety.
Well, the last half just seems, it's like the terrorism thing like takes a back seat to like Hub and the general's fight.
Yeah.
Like figure out what the problem is. And I mean, yes, like it is important to explore like what are the ramifications of martial law, like what would that look like, what are the steps it would take, but it definitely muddies the plot as far as like what the original intention of the movie was.
Well, and I think really muddies the messaging, because the second half of the movie is supposed to be, I mean, the conflict between those two characters is a metaphor for the conflict between the two approaches to counter-terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And we're presumably supposed to come down on Hub's side and believe that the whole, diplomatic or law enforcement approach is much better. But yet I came away from the film thinking, ultimately what it's saying is, it doesn't matter which approach we take as long as we get the damn terrorists.
Yeah.
Especially when you're taking historical context into view, and like I couldn't help but do that every step of this movie, because that's just the whole thing. Like everything that we did, like everything that he said in that beautiful speech about, like, when they're going to terrorize the guy, and it just makes me sad because we ended up going with that method. We ended up torturing lots of people, and it just, like, fuck, like none of this means anything because we ended up going up with that terrible way of doing things anyway.
Yeah, it really, the any of the goodwill that it seems that it would have had, it just gets so muddied and vapid over any sense of reality. And as like you said, Kay, that once the army comes in, now Hub has to, that's essentially all he does for the remainder of the movie, is deal with Devereaux and the army in one way or another. It's not him back in his office or back in his apartment because his office got blown up, trying to figure out what the next move is, trying to figure out what they're going to do. And so the next section I want to talk about, and there was some definite changes in here that you guys are going to be interested in. So Elise and Hub are sitting in Hub's Crown Vic, and she's kind of spilling all of her beans to him about what was really going on. And so the first line of dialogue, which was one that wasn't included, she says it was going to be beautiful, referring to her mission. And then there was a policy shift. The new doctrine was Iran will be too powerful if Iraq falls apart. And then we move into a line that was left in the movie. And it's not like we sold them out exactly. We just stopped helping them. And I wasn't allowed to tell them what was coming down. I was ordered not to tell them. And they got slaughtered. And then this back to another piece that was entirely kept out of the movie. You got to understand, these people believe paradise, bliss. To us, they're just words, but to them, it's very beautiful, actually. And when you look at their lives, the heartbreak, and what do? We think we can take advantage of that. And then she says that I quit, I came home, I just can't do it anymore. And they Hub kind of, some lines that I'm really glad they left in there is that she mentions about, she's trying to save them because of the Gulf War, to get them out in time, and she gets them visas, but she leaves out that she taught them how to make bombs. And Hub just says that, said, you taught them how to do it, and now here they are doing exactly what you taught them to do. And the last one, and it depends on where you're at watching the movies, going through its narrative, but she mentions to him that the most committed wins. That's a phrase that you can so take wrong in so many different ways depending on what the situation is. And she was mentioning about that, the most committed to whatever it happens to be are the people that win. Well, that's not true. America, quote unquote, wins all the time, but in terms of our commitment just to that idea, it can wax and wane a good bit. Did you guys want to comment on that section with Elise?
It's definitely like a culture war statement, of like the most committed. It's like, oh, we have to be committed if we want to defeat terrorism, not maybe just stop killing people and actually try to help better their lives. I like that part though, where they do show, it's like, look, like this is another example of chickens coming home to roost. Of
Hmm.
like we decided to give people the means and resources to accomplish a goal that we wanted, and then when it doesn't matter anymore, or when the objectives change from the American perspective, it's just fuck it, whatever. And it, I don't know, like, I don't know how people who do that job, because the friends of mine that I know that have done humans, like done the human intelligence where you're developing assets and stuff, it's it just sounds insane to me. To like, you have to be so buddy buddy with people, you have to develop that rapport, that friendship, promise them all these things, and then the minute that they stop being an asset, or the minute that that there is some kind of potential for exposure of your assets, they just get cut loose, and you have to go in there and pretend like you don't even fucking know them. And I can't even imagine, like, how the fuck does somebody do that job where you have to like lie to people and promise them all these things, and then if that no longer aligns with the goals of what you're trying to do there, you have to just cut ties. And just, oh, it's just so gross that, like, I'm glad that they brought that up. But yeah, it's like, I wish they would have explored that more, of the whole reason that this is happening. It's sad because Elise takes it on herself and feels like, oh, it's my fault. But it's not her fault. It's the fucking CIA's fault. It's
Yeah.
the foreign policy objectives and the way that we go about doing this. That's the fucking problem. But they don't want to talk about that in the movie.
But it seems like that Elise here is trying to pull in as much blame as she can onto her plate, so that
Yeah.
it seems a little bit like the CIA less so, more Sharon's fault, and that can be part of the cutting off too. Because if somebody does make a mistake, or does something that we're not in line with, they can lose their job working for spooks in the same way.
Well,
But it
and it's the
is,
same thing with Devereaux too. It's like, you want to put in and all these things that he's doing. It's like, oh, he's just a guy with too much power that's gone off the rails. And it's
yeah,
like, no, like,
exactly. It's not the
he
army,
is
it's not the
following
U.S. government.
procedure.
Yeah, yeah, he's doing exactly what we've trained a general to do, which is to fight.
Again, I think this part of the story where it's kind of revealed that these terrorists are essentially our terrorists,
Yep.
or at least were in the past, and that this was some sort of, destabilize the Iraqi government through terrorism thing, which is kind of ironic given that following the invasion of Iraq, that was
Right.
actually a policy that was adopted vis-a-vis Iran, is actually to train and fund and encourage terrorists to try and destabilize the Iranian government. But it hasn't really worked, because in a lot of assessments, Iran was actually been probably the main beneficiary of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That their
Absolutely.
position is in a lot of ways actually strengthened by those
Yep.
wars. Mostly because those wars have gone so horribly wrong, but it could have gone differently, I guess, in theory. But it's
That's
like,
interesting,
yeah,
the Iran part that they cut out.
Yeah, I was really surprised
Mm.
to see that somebody actually wrote that. The fact that it didn't get filmed makes perfect sense, but and this was written by is it Lawrence Tribe?
Lawrence Wright, the guy who
Right,
wrote the Looming
Lawrence Wright.
Tower.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and the writing in it is real good, and you can see kind of his things in here, his little additions to stuff, and um. So
I think all the good parts of the script are the stuff
right.
that came from Lawrence Wright, to be honest.
Right.
That's right. That's right.
Um,
Um.
The
So
nuance.
then we get into the final 15-20 minutes of the movie. There's a scene with Devereaux standing behind his men, and I wrote just surveying the chaos. He's standing in the back with his beret on, just kind of watching things, and there's several lines of troops, people on a PA yelling people need to disperse. And I was thinking to myself, the bosses don't come. The bosses, they don't come. This should have been just a bunch of soldiers. Maybe there was some tight ass lieutenant colonel who was out there specifically watching his unit for some reason. But a 2-star general is not going to stand in the back of a formation that are doing riot ops, essentially. It makes absolutely no sense. So in that scene, there was a couple different things that weren't included that were in the original script. The main one that I want to point out is that in between one of the comments where a lieutenant on a bullhorn is saying, this unlawful gathering, you must disperse. The script says it cuts to either pictures or very short film segments of soldiers in full riot gear in Selma, Alabama in 1963, in Chicago in 1968, and in Los Angeles in 1993.
Whoa.
The first two, of course, it dealt with the civil rights era, and the third was the Watts riots that happened in 93. And so they made the it's very clear that Lawrence wanted to draw those lines here and say, do you not realize that these are our continuing chickens coming home to roost in terms of military policy being used and taking soldiers out on the street, that it actually has happened in our lifetimes or in the lifetimes of our parents, and that we should really know it. But to me, it was a wonderful inclusion in terms of us trying to understand that we've seen this before and we will see it again. The fact that it seems movie over the top doesn't mean that it's not reality. And then the protesters are yelling on bullhorns as well. One of them yells out to join together, join hands. And then it says that a young girl unselfconsciously approaches a young soldier. She looks right into his eyes, smiles, and walks past. Another marcher walks right past the soldier, who does nothing to stop him. And soon they are all surging past the riot line. Like, these soldiers said, I'm not going to do this. At least one or two of them, I'm not stopping these people because I don't know how that's going to end in some way there. But none of that was included in part of the movie. The only part was that just to disperse, and you can see it's this whole pile of these little scenes adding up to something that was much more self-conscious and politically honest than what we got. Tom, you mentioned it. We just ended up with this vapid anti-terrorism film that didn't really tell us anything, where Wright really wanted things to be told. He wanted to reinforce the innocence of Arab Americans and to not demonize them as we went through this. But that's not what the ending script came up with.
Well, and the choice of those three clips that you talk about, you've got people who were protesting because they wanted civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're sympathetic and perfectly legitimate. Chicago in '68 was primarily about opposition to the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. So again, sympathetic and very legitimate. And then in the early 90s in Los Angeles, they were essentially protesting against police brutality and racism. Mm-hmm. So again, you're on the side of all of these protesters, right?
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
You should be, to be honest.
Yeah,
and by stripping out that, it not only rips out the context of this is actually a trajectory that America has been on for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. This is actually a struggle that is already happening. It also strips out the parallels of, we should sympathize with these protesters because there is a history of perfectly legitimate protesters protesting against something they have a right and, should be opposed to, being in some way brutalized or violated, or in some cases actually killed. I'm thinking Kent State in particular, by either the military, the police, or some combination of both. And so that skews the values of that entire closing sequence. And also it means it also means the plot doesn't work as well, because the kind of the twist is that they think there's another cell out there, but it turns out there isn't. No. And that the so-called final cell is actually the terrorist that Elise has been screwing throughout the whole movie, like she's Carrie Matheson. And that's supposed to be kind of the big twist and reveal at the end, is that he's going to go and suicide bomb this protest. And I was first left thinking, they didn't really save the best till last, did they? Because they've already blown up an entire federal building.
Right.
This guy's going to go and kill, half a dozen protesters. It's not that big a deal. I mean, it's obviously that would be a very bad thing to happen. But, in cinematic terms, they're not really building towards something here. And because we don't really see much of these protesters, we don't particularly care about them, their relevance to the plot is fairly minimal. Yeah. There isn't that sense of threat there. that
No.
this is something that should be protected, that we don't want this I mean, by that point, I just didn't care whether the terrorists blew up the protest or not. And yeah, so the plot kind of fails as well as stripping out all of the political and social and historical relevance. That was a really bad change. They really shouldn't have taken that out. Yeah.
That's sad. I also like it. What caught my eye as well was the fact that, when initially when they had started the martial law and they were doing the clips of like people on the radio, it's like the people's opinion of what's going on, and there was people who were in support of it and people who weren't. But then, like, when it comes to the protest time, it's like all of a sudden everybody's on the side of the protesters, and I was like, we know that absolutely would not fucking happen.
No.
Like, we would still have that dividing line of the people who are afraid and think that the military is going to protect them versus the people who know that this is unlawful and absolutely criminal. And it's just like reducing the like conflict into those kind of like, oh, like, well, this is wrong, so of course Americans are against it. And it's like, we fucking know that wouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
No, you'd get protests and counter protests and mutual recrimination and accusation, and yeah, of course.
And it could also be another connection about the literal protest, the Arab Americans' issues with this is that showing them it's not clear. It doesn't clear what the way that the movie is not clear how it feels about Arab Americans or American Muslims. It jumps back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and so even the places where it is good is still kind of shitty for that reason, because we don't know what the real point is here. So we move on to one of the final scenes of the movie where Samir takes Elise to this bathhouse, and they're supposedly waiting for the leader of the final cell or the final cell to come there and meet them. And in the context of being in the bathhouse, Elise realizes that Samir is the final cell, that he's the last cell. But there were some really key differences between the original script and what we ended up seeing in the movie. In the script, Samir completely disrobes, where in the movie he only ends up taking off his shirt. After he completely disrobes, he actually fully gets in the water and bathes himself as somebody would in this situation. And then he puts on a death shroud, and then he puts civilian clothes over the top of it. But we don't see any of that context at all. It's just that he takes off his shirt, he gets down really close to the water and washes his face and his hands, but that's all that he does. He also, in the script, he takes a lot longer to put the bomb on his body. In terms of doing it, it actually shows, that I'm putting literal explosives on myself. I'm taking some care in it, where in the movie, it's like he's putting on a backpack going back to college. Is that this giant ass bomb, and you kind of throw it around like, it's just your book bag. But in the original script, where Elise asks them why she's done this before she mentions the thing about the Quran, he tells her very specifically, I want you to bleed as we have bled. And if they had included that, it'd been like, okay, so he is here because of America's murderous involvement in the Middle East in one way or another, if we wanted to look at that. But without that context, there, it could be a terrorist for any reason, 70 virgins, and that they're able to write that in much more concrete terms so people can understand it, as opposed to it being, scary, mythical, religious kind of talk that, in terms of 70 virgins, they could make it much better. And then the last biggest changes that they made was that in the movie, Samir kills Elise. He's using Elise as a human shield, and he ends up shooting her in the back. In the script, Hub shoots Elise. He actually shoots her. She it creates some distance, and then Hub is trying at first he's trying to shoot the detonator out of his hand. It really adds more practicality to this situation of a terrorist with a bomb on his chest with the human shield. And then there's still the same dying scene, but he tells her, or excuse me, she tells him her real name is Emma. So there's a little bit of I'm going out the door. This is who I really am, kind of thing, and it adds something more solid to her identity versus comparing to the two fake names that we've heard for her. And Hub actually asked her in the original script if she knew Samira was the final cell, and she says, "I wondered." Like, that was always a possibility in the back of her mind, but she never shared it before now. So there's some real changes there that they really could nail in on the intelligence community's portion of this, in terms of culpability with this whole scene. And the last part of it is that the prayer she says at the end in the script is in Arabic. She gives what I believe is a Muslim prayer, versus in the actual movie we have her reciting the Lord's Prayer, a Christian prayer. Again, we have that horrible dumbing down of Muslim belief, Muslim religion, and pushing it back to the Christian side. And the other part of that scene is that Frank, dude from Lebanon, dude with this is his culture. He's standing above Elise, crying, translating what she's saying for Hub, telling him. And so you see that that interconnectivity there, but that whole scene just wastes all that shit.
That's so disappointing.
Oh, and the last thing she says is Allah Akbar, God is great, and Hub doesn't really do anything. He doesn't help her recite the Lord's Prayer there. He just ends up saying Amen. But it so much a stronger connection that could have made with Arab Americans to that there is the occasional white person who attempts to understand, who attempts to be there, even in this context, a spook, but still it's just gross.
Yeah, that would have been so humanizing and so empathizing for
Right.
everybody, because it throws me off, because I was like, well, her whole character is about being enmeshed in this culture, understanding it, and so then why would she all of a sudden just start reciting the fucking Lord's Prayer?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well, and it would have meant that the movie, or at least, essentially, that the movie would have ended on a moment of empathy and mutual understanding, as Elise realizes it's because she lost her humanity due to this horrendous institution that she works for. That's why she's now dying.
Yeah.
That this isn't just blowback for America in general. This is blowback for her personally.
Right.
And that she tries to, grab hold of her humanity and something sacred before she goes. That's good drama, if nothing else.
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
even leaving aside philosophy and thematics and what have you, that just would have been a better ending for the movie. And to have the three of them there, and they are essentially our three main characters in this story, having a moment together, a sad moment, but, some kind of mutual understanding coming out of this. Thematically and philosophically, that's quite powerful. But instead, it just gets reduced to, oh, well, she's dead, but at least we got the fucking terrorist, so everything's all right, I guess.
And there's also the reduction of Frank's character, that aside from him being at the stadium trying to find his son, which is something we can all relate to, here he is knowing that this, that Elise did all these things, and he's still trying to maintain that connection for himself, that's how he's tied in. And it would have made his character much more approachable and much less of a just kind of like you mentioned, Ali Soufan wannabe kind of person, in terms of having a legitimate character of his own and following that arc to the end.
Right. They never even touched that. After he goes through the whole thing, he throws his badge at a Hubbard, and then it's just like all of a sudden they have a lead, and so now he's back on. Like, what the fuck?
I'm not. I'm not your sand. Tell them I'm not their sand nigger anymore. That was,
and then goes and
that
just
was how
becomes
pissed off he was at that moment.
Right.
And then for it to just come back, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. So last scene of the movie, this is where Hubbard and his agents confront Devereaux and his staff. And I got just a couple script changes, but this area is quite different too. So he asks Hubbard, "Do you want to tell me exactly what you mean detaining Colonel Hardwick and 6 of my CID staff?" Here's the new line, or the old line, whatever. Because this strikes me as a very peculiar idea of interagency liaison. And Hub says last cell was taken down. It was Samir. Devereaux's like, what makes you so sure? Hub says Sharon. Devereaux says Sharon is not trustworthy. Hub says Sharon is dead. She gave her life, which of course with the scene we just read would have meant a lot more at this moment. He then takes a piece of paper from his pocket and says, "This is a writ from the U.S. District Court releasing all those being held here without habeas corpus." And they argue and they go back and forth very much like they did in the movie. Hub mentions about clear violation of international law, congressional oversight statutes, a couple of treaties, the federal perjury statute, and my favorite, the Logan Act, for conducting your own personal foreign policy. I know the whole story, General. And then Devereaux says, "You don't know shit. Poor suffering Sharon and her poor suffering people." Here's the start of the unincluded line. "It's called, quote unquote, going native, the most elementary error of an intelligence operative, and she made it. She had all of you working for her, and she was working for them without even knowing it. And now they're getting exactly what they want, which is the Sheik will be back in the mix. But 10 times as strong, because now he's the big man who stood up to Americans. I did what was necessary. I make no apologies. If you think you're going to be able to use that file against me, you know even less about politics than I imagined." And Hub says, "General, I'm not in politics. You can have this back. I won't use it." And he hands him the file that the chief of staff gave him that would have given him everything he needed to legally take down Devereaux and the occupation of the military. And Devereaux is like, "Because you don't have the balls to go after him. Did you expect me to get all weepy with gratitude? You serve your country. Is there anything else?" And Hub said, "I wasn't in politics. I said I wasn't in politics. I'm not. I'm in law enforcement." And then he takes his gun from his shoulder holster, which didn't happen in the movie. Denzel was just standing there, and the other agents came in with their weapons drawn. But I mean, he's in a room filled with soldiers carrying assault rifles, and he, before anybody else, takes out his pistol, and then he tells him, he says, "William Devereaux, you're under arrest for the torture and murder of Tariq Husseini. Surrender your weapon." And that's when they come in. They argue a little bit about, "I serve my country, why don't you try serving yours?" Bruce Willis says, "I am the law." And then Denzel goes into his, "You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to not be tortured, not be murdered. Rights that you took away from Tariq Husseini, you have those rights, given by the men and women who came before you in that uniform." Of course, this wasn't what was in the original script. A lot of that extra stuff, men and women in uniform and having those rights, that wasn't included in the initial one. So they made this whole cowboy standoff more pointed than it should have been, but it absolutely lacked that whole context. And also, this also brings in the whole thing with the judge, that this would have been after the original script had him meeting with the judge for the second time trying to get a warrant. And in that time, he had all the evidence he needed, and so the process was much simpler. But without it, we're not actively seeing Hub trying to fight these other centers of power to do what he needs to do, and the pushback that he gets. And so we're left with cowboy standoff. Give him the order, General. Tell him make murderers out of these young kids. And then he says, "Stand down, Sergeant," and he lets them take him into custody. And the movie ends literally with the army driving away across the Brooklyn Bridge. And I'm like, what? I mean, I understand that the troops wouldn't start firing on FBI agents and stuff. That makes sense. But why is it that within minutes of this thing happening, that the army gets in their tanks and trucks and okay, we're out. They told us we're not needed here anymore, or whatever.
Right,
It
and
is.
it just all the kids are leaving, or the people are leaving the stadium, and you get to
Yep,
see
all the
Frank and
kids
his
leaving the
son,
stadium. Yep,
and they're
they're,
like, "Oh yeah, this is such a
yep.
nice like wrapped up with a bow," and but you're just like what the fuck? Like there's all these unanswered questions, and all the like the main point of the movie, like we never see the shake, we never understand, there's no wrapping up of like the actual thing that was driving the plot.
No,
Yeah.
no, no confirmation from the army that they did in fact get the last cell, which I'm sure some of them were probably concerned about. Yeah,
Well, and particularly that thing with them driving back over the bridge. I mean, that is an efficiency probably unheard of in the U.S. Army.
oh Lord, yes.
For one thing.
We,
Um,
yeah, we would
but
have been
also
there
just
for another
from
2
like a
weeks in
logistics
barracks.
point of view, they've
Yeah, yeah,
invaded an
yeah.
entire borough of Manhattan.
Ten
Yeah,
thousand.
10,000
Quite a
people.
long time to unwind and
It does.
dismantle.
It really does. Yeah. But no,
An entire division is 10,000 soldiers, right?
but yeah, I think he said 10,700 men.
Yeah.
But we're also it's also really pushing the assumption that okay, the legality for us being here has ended. We're gonna go home. That's not what happens. That's not what
Yeah.
happens at all. And it could have, taken another 10 minutes and kind of worked through that a little bit, and we could have gotten these other scenes, but they would have been much more earned. But instead, we're left with this, okay, he told him we can't do anymore, and so I guess soldiers are going to go home. No, they're not. But that's what we want people to think. We want people to think that military leaders, that law enforcement officers, they come up against these hardened points of morality and they say, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing this stupid thing you want me to do because it's illegal, it's immoral, it's anti-American, whatever it is. And that's not what happens. We have yes men. And Devereaux is one of those yes men. All of the entire apparatus that he's dealing with in this movie would have been knowable by people above him in the echelon. So the idea that presidents don't always know everything, but they usually can access anything that they want to. But we can't.
Right. They would get the information to know what kind of person he was and like what,
Yeah.
and it's just again this like American rah-rah, like the individual who believes in justice and the law, like triumphs over bad people. And it's like the nuance is just cut out.
Well, and to go back to that line that you highlighted earlier, Henry, about the most committed wins.
Yep.
Well, who is actually most committed in this ending scenario? What if you have two opposing forces that are both equally committed?
Mm-hmm.
What
Yeah.
happens then? You know what I mean? I'm not just saying that as a kind of, tree falling in the forest kind of thought experiment. I'm saying what kind of sense can we make out of a statement like that? Because
Right.
what actually triumphs in this movie?
Yeah.
Who triumphs? I guess you could say it's ultimately Denzel Washington's character, sort of. But in terms of, this is supposed to be about the struggle between different attitudes to a certain extent, different mentalities, but also different approaches to this insurgent problem of this terrorist organization.
Yeah.
Though it does also seem at the end they're not strictly terrorists, they're just seeking violent retribution. They're not actually like, there's no political goal here, they're just kind of blowing some stuff up and killing some people because that's what happened to them.
Yeah, which again, like, is cutting the nuance out and cutting out the motivation and
It's
like
like
a real human's motivation.
It's like us saying people at the Capitol siege had no legitimate criticisms, have no legitimate reasons as to why they're doing that. Not to defend what they're doing, but that, the economics are a big part of it. And they just cut all of that out. What if there were more cells left in the city? What if they assumed that was the last cell and there was 2 or 3 more of them? We didn't get any closure to any of that.
Well, and like what happens to Devereaux after he's arrested?
Right.
Yep.
Could
he
we at least
tried?
have, just a 10-second shot of him in a courtroom being sworn
Yeah.
in, or something, for heaven's
Something.
sake,
Yeah. Yeah.
to imply that this had consequences. This had a lasting effect. There was traumatic echoes of what had happened here, which is what would actually happen in that scenario. People would still be feeling that 10 years later.
Yeah.
Instead, it's just sort of, we kind of pushed the button and reversed everything. It's like, after the Civil War, when Lincoln reinstituted habeas corpus, that it wasn't just like he wrote a letter that went out to the entire country and everything just magically shifted in one go. And to be honest, that was ultimately ruled unlawful anyway.
Yeah.
Without getting bogged down in all of that, you take my point that, once you've made that decision to take such an extreme step, you cannot just unwind it easily. That's one of the whole problems with authoritarianism and with state power, is it's actually remarkably difficult to pare it back, even when there's like a mass movement in support of that, even when there is political will to do that. It's still, there is the institutional resistance, there is the cultural resistance, there's a whole bunch of other factors as well, just from a practical point of view, as to, well, if we're not allowed to do this anymore, what do we actually do? All of these things make that so ludicrously unrealistic. And for a film that tries so hard to remain grounded in a, what would this actually look like?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost a thought experiment of a movie, like, what would this actually be like if this happened? And in so many places, it manages to touch on something that you think, yeah, there's some thought gone into this. There's some real intelligence and subtlety of the human condition that's gone into this. And in so many other moments, that is completely undermined by just dunderheaded bad writing and bad directing. And I have a feeling a lot of these cuts that you're talking about from the last 10 minutes of the movie, I think they were partly just trying to speed up the ending. They were trying to get to a quick, easy, simple resolution. But it's like, no, if you're going to tell this story, you're never going to have a quick, easy, simple resolution. It's always going to linger. It's always going to be a bit complicated, and people are going to come away from this not quite sure how they feel about it. Mm-hmm. So embrace that. Embrace that complexity and that nuance and that subtlety. And you'll have a much richer movie that's really about something.
Right. And then people would leave the theater thinking about it, and they would be thinking about what their role is in that and how they would think about it in those situations. And like you said, Tom, like, if that is the point, if the point is to be grounded in reality, like, fuck, there's your ending. Like, that's the best way to do it.
Absolutely. And this really isn't difficult. I mean, none of us are professional screenwriters, for heaven's sake, but we can all see that's the better way to end this film, if that's what you're really honestly trying to do here. And I have a feeling that script that you've read, evidently an early script, was much more ambitious in what it was trying to do. And somewhere along the line, I think a combination of the studio and the FBI who worked on this film stripped out a lot of the best stuff and reduced this to, again, it's something that's kind of
good.
I mean, is this a good film or not? It's hard to say. Right. I honestly don't know how I feel about this film, because there are so many good things about it and so many terrible things about it that I'm left uncertain as to what the hell this movie even is, let alone whether I think it's a good thing that it exists. Hard to say for me.
I'm glad that he was able to do the Looming Tower, because I feel like at the end of that miniseries, you do feel that way. You do feel like, okay, we see how we got to 9/11 and like the choices that we made or that people made in order to get here. And you end like, what happens already, so it's not like you're surprised, but like that like added to it for me. Like when I finished that, I was just like, I was left feeling that way about like, fuck, like here's all the choices that we made collectively and people made individually, and what could we do to prevent these things from happening? Like it left you thinking that way. And it's frustrating that in a movie that was really, it was really ambitious to talk about the United States military occupying a part of it, of like the biggest city in America.
Mm.
And yeah, it's just disappointing that they wanted to turn it into this like easy, simple, like America good, terrorism bad, and like people should follow the law, basically.
Well, and sort of underpinning that is this whole the only good Muslims are the ones that are wholly on the side of law enforcement or ideally working for law enforcement.
Yeah.
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 Because basically every other Muslim in this entire thing is either a terrorist or just a sort of random guy on the street who gets swept into a football stadium.
That's it.
That's it.
That's it. No, it's very clear, both seeing what they removed and the final product of the movie, as to why so many Arab Americans, and I'm sure other Arabs that saw it in other places, found it. It didn't represent them in any concrete way, in anything that we would look at and say, this seems like a fully formed person. Even if they are the bad guy, we at least have some understanding. And I thought the mention about Iran was, for Wright's part, was really ambitious, because that is the reality, and the reality that we've lived with since the main part of the war in Iraq ended, although we still have troops there, that this was very common knowledge, that Iraq was its stability, it being able to be stable, was holding back Iran, but not so much that Bush, Cheney, Wolfowitz, any of those dickheads were willing to admit that reality, were willing to actually work within that. They had their own ambitions, but the reality was the same. And I'm guessing this was written, it came out in 98, so it had to have been written 95, 96, quite a long time before mission accomplished. But I thought it was bold that it was in there. So yeah, but it makes perfect sense why it was all pared down. Like I said, we're save for time, remove the most nascent elements that actually give a little bit of context but are unappealing to the Bureau or the federal government more in general. And pushing, there's a good guy in Denzel and a good bad guy in Devereaux, and that back and forth. And even that isn't really established too much, because you only get that one scene with just the two of them. And I could see them, getting into a fist fight in a room by themselves, having this kind of argument. Even that would have been better context than what they gave us.
Well, and for a story that's supposed to be about how we've talked about this before, the difference between an intelligence-based approach to a counterinsurgency and a military-based approach. This is a film that is, okay, it's talking about counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency, but whatever. It's the same basic power dynamic.
It's basically the same, yeah.
Yeah. It's supposed to be a film about how much better the intelligence-based approach is, but does anyone actually achieve anything in this film using that approach?
Nope.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, honestly, it's all the things that they get are through the the bold action and the not caring about consequences bullshit.
Yeah, it's not, and also is that Elise doesn't give Hub enough information early enough in the movie to actually push back some of this. Because if she had said that whole her training these guys in Iraq thing much sooner, there would have been intelligence there that they would have been able to grab onto. But because it came, 2/3 of the movie are already done when she has this mea culpa moment, that doesn't, it's entirely a non-issue.
I do find that a little bit curious, that how is it that Lawrence Wright or someone who worked on this movie decided we're going to cast a female red-haired CIA officer who is withholding information from the FBI? How did they know that was going on in 1998? Because that's exactly what Alfredo Francis Bukowski was doing at Alex Station at this time, as is depicted in The Looming Tower.
Right, I was just thinking, I was like, they must really dislike the CIA. I mean, it's not hard to dislike the CIA, because if anybody's done any cursory fucking research on what the agency has done over the years, knows that they're terrible. But it's just, wow, like...
It's just so on point, because you've clearly got this cast of characters that are based on John O'Neill, Mark Rossini, Ali Soufan. There's a couple of others in there that certainly they were people in the I-49 squad in the FBI building in New York, just as they are in the movie. You also have this CIA character who seems so much like Bukowski, it's unreal, because no one who in like 96, or whenever we're presuming this screenplay was written, no one knew who Bukowski was. Alex Station had barely been founded at that point. So maybe that is just one of those really weird coincidences, which it could be. But
Well,
that is something I came away from this film wondering about, was like, just how much inside information did they have when they were first putting this together?
Well, I think it's so easy to see, like the CIA, like pre 9/11, the CIA and the FBI were like, you know, they were like oil and vinegar, and they like, it like I said in the beginning, like it blows my mind the way that like everyone was so compartmentalized with information, and it's still, I mean, things are like, that's the whole point of the community, is like everyone has need to know, and you have to have specific clearance and a specific read-in to know a specific thing. But like when it comes to operations, there's a lot more latitude nowadays about sharing information, just because we saw, like, people saw all the bullshit of like trying to do operations with incomplete facts. So that's something that's been around a long time, and I think that the writers like totally picked up on that.
Oh, that is a theme. Sure. That's where they're coming from. It was more that character herself. I can't, because, you know, she's basically the same character as in Zero Dark 30. She's kind of the same character as Carrie Matheson, who is loosely based on Francis Bukowski, in the same way that Saul Berenson is loosely based on Michael Scheuer. I mean, it has to be a coincidence. I can't believe Lawrence Wright knew that at the time, because no one knew that there was this, you know, red-headed senior officer at Alex Station in the CIA who was intimately involved in withholding all this information from the FBI. It has to be a weird coincidence, but it is a weird one.
Yeah. Well, fellas, I think that's a good place for us to call it a day. Tom, you have a documentary coming out pretty soon. Would you tell the folks a little bit about that and where they can find it when it comes out?
Sure. The documentary is called Theatres of Command. It's being directed by Roger Stahl, who wrote Militainment Inc. and has made written a bunch of books and documentaries as well, and is being co-produced by me and Matt, who wrote National Security Cinema, which I imagine most people are familiar with. That's probably the most famous thing I've ever done. It's essentially started out as a documentary version of the book, but it's expanded quite considerably beyond that, simply because we have so much more information now, so many more documents, so much more of everything. And so it's more of a exploration of how the whole military and to some extent CIA relationship with Hollywood works, and specifically what the purpose of this is in terms of sanitizing war, in terms of remediating screwed up events so that they start to look like successes. There's a whole number of themes that we draw out in the documentary about what actual effect has all of this had in terms of shaping people's perceptions of these institutions and of war policies and intelligence and security policies and so on. And has been delayed several times, to be honest, partly due to COVID things. And frankly, if it came out now, no one would see it even if we could get it into cinemas, no one could see it. So that's not really a problem. It's sometime in the coming months, certainly by the summer it should be out. It's being distributed by MEF, the Media Education Foundation. So it will be available on their site in DVD form. There will obviously be links on my site, spyculture.com. And we're hoping to get some screenings and maybe some live Q&A events going around the release of the documentary to sort of help spread the word. Yeah, I mean, keep an eye on my site, spyculture.com, if you're interested in any of my work, but particularly this documentary, and you'll see the news as soon as it's available. I'll stick up a big banner so everyone knows.
Well, I'll include a link for the trailer in the show notes. So if you guys want to take a quick peek before it comes out, please do that. And please, everyone, let us know what you thought of this episode. I hope that it's been a good education in trying to understand that sometimes there are good stories out there, good legitimate ones that get pared down and diluted and filled full of crap to the point that it, like what Tom's mentioned numerous times, is like, how do I even really feel about this particular product, because it goes back and forth in so many different ways. But thank you guys for joining us today, and we will see you next time. We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not